Well, folks, let's get started. If you haven't picked up a lesson outline, they're on the tables there in front. How are you, my brother? Well, thanks. Good. Well, I'm glad that you did. Glad that you did. She's a little bit under the weather. Well, we have, I think, some folks from Eric's class with us this morning. We're delighted to have you. This morning, we're going to take just a little break from the book of Daniel. I had promised you I'd finish that up this morning, but as it turned out, the schedule's a little different from what I thought. So we're taking a little break from Daniel, and Grant would like for me to finish that up first 2 Sundays of the new year that we have class. So this morning we'll do a lesson a little more appropriate to the season that I term the fullness of time. But before we do that, let's ask God's blessing upon our study. And might I ask Bernie, would you lead us in prayer, please? Amen. Well, I'm glad to have all of you with us this morning. This lesson is a condensation of 3 lessons that I wrote some years ago, and I was asked to condense it into a single lesson. So we'll have this this morning, and we'll preface that by a look at what I term the direction of history. One of the things that each of us has to decide for himself is whether or not we have any purpose in life. And that's wrapped up ultimately in the meaning of history. Put a little differently, would ask, is history going anywhere? And if it's going anywhere, are we going with it? Well, for those outside of Christ, I don't think that question can be satisfactorily answered. But for those of us who are in Christ, it does in fact have an answer. We're not like, for example, the Greeks, who thought that history was cyclical. They viewed history as being a little bit like their Greek god Sisyphus, who started at the bottom of a mountain and rolled a stone up a hill, and just as he got to the top, the stone got away from him and rolled all the way back down. He had to start over again. And he was doomed to repeat this process throughout history. Are we like that? Is the whole human race like that? Or does God have something different in mind for all of us? I claim that he does, and I claim that the basis for thinking that can be found in a very innocuous-looking passage in Galatians 4:4. For here Paul writes, "When the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, in order that he might redeem those under the law, and that we might receive our adoption as sons." Now, this passage, though it's a kind of an innocent-looking passage, is just loaded with meaning, because what it has to say is that God had so channeled all of the courses of history in such a way, when Jesus came into the world, that they were just optimal. We might call it in today's vernacular a perfect storm. What does perfect storm mean? It's usually spoken in a negative sort of way, isn't it? It's where all of the negative circumstances come together at one point in time to produce a big disaster. Well, the opposite was true when God channeled his courses of history together to achieve just what he wanted to achieve. And that was a set of circumstances such that when Jesus came into the world, the circumstances were just right for his mission to succeed. One writer I have read on this has to say that had Jesus come into the world 10 years earlier or 10 years later, his mission would have failed. But all of the circumstances were just right for his mission to succeed. It was a time of cultural fullness. It was a time of philosophical fullness. It was a time of religious fullness when Jesus came into the world, and a time as well of cultural fullness. So God had so channeled these forces, and the fact that he did so is best seen in the prophecies concerning the coming of Jesus. Now think about this for a minute. If you're not in control of history, can you invest your profits with images as to what's going to happen in the future? Let me ask that again. If you're not in control of history, can you tell people about what's going to happen in the future? Well, the answer to that, of course, is what, Jeanette? You have it, I think. The answer is no. Of course you can't. I can no more tell you what's going to happen tomorrow than anyone else. But God can tell you what's going to happen centuries in the future because he controls the currents of history. And that's what Paul is talking about in this marvelous passage in Galatians. So let's have a look this morning at the prophecies concerning the coming Messiah and God's intention in sending him at just the right time. The first, we're going to look up a lot of passages this morning, so open your Bible and work with me on this. The lesson will make a whole lot more sense, I think, if you look at the passages yourself. And in fact, take the lesson outline home and look at them in your private studies. The first one we want to look at is not exactly the earliest, but it's the first that we'll look at this morning, is found in Genesis 49, 10, and 11. Genesis 49, 10, and 11. What's the context here of this prophecy? What's the background? What's happening? That's exactly right. Where was he sitting at the time? On his deathbed. He would die just very shortly after this. And the Jews that had come with him, his sons and daughters and all of his relatives who had come down to Egypt to meet Joseph, were all in Egypt with him, about 75 people or so. And Jacob begins then to speak about the future fortunes of his son. And he gets down to Judah. That's marked in verse 9. Here's what he has to say about Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And to him shall the obedience of the peoples be. Now, it is open to objection, you know, that you're taking passages out of context and all this sort of thing when you point to a prophecy like this. If you're just coming in, there's some lesson outlines on the table there. It's open to objection that you're taking passages out of context, you know, and giving them meanings that they never had. But the interesting thing about this passage is that the Jews accepted it as being prophetic of the Messiah. The Jews living at the time Jesus came accepted that passage as being prophetic of the Messiah. If you would like to look this matter a little further, there's a set of books by Alfred Edersheim entitled The Life and Times of the Messiah. It's 2-volume set. I'd at least advise you to get both volumes because one is quite heavy by itself. But there's an appendix in the back of the second volume where he tabulates some 610 passages believed by the Jews, not by Gentiles who came after Jesus, but by Jews who lived before him, of passages that referred to the coming of the Messiah, and this is one of the passages. Shiloh, of course, in Hebrew means what? Well, it's related to the term shalom, which means what? Peace. That's right. And the passage refers then to that Prince of Peace who would gather all of the nations unto himself. This passage, by the way, goes back to about 1731 BCE. Now look at this, by the way, is the who. And what I need to say before we pass on is that the identity of the Messiah is here defined, broadly speaking, because he was to come out of the tribe of Judah. The Messiah was to come from the tribe of Judah. Well, let's look at the narrowing then of the identity of the Messiah. To do that, let's turn over to 2 Samuel 7, and it's verses 11b, that's the last half of verse 11, where David wanted to build a temple to his God. And of course, God declines to have him do this because David was said to be what? A warrior, a man of blood. That's right. However, he does make David a promise as a sort of a second prize. And he says down, and we'll not read this all, but he tells David that he'll raise up a descendant after him who will come forth from him, and that his kingdom will be to what extent? Forever. That's right. So the scope of the who, of the Messiah's identity, comes now from, broadly speaking, Judah to more narrowly David. Okay? Well, let's look a little further still. Let's look at the famous Isaiah passage. Oh, I need to mention, too, by the way, that this prophecy given to David goes back to about 976 BCE. And you can compute these dates if you're patient out of the text of the Scriptures. Let's look at the famous Isaiah passage in Isaiah 7. What's the background on this passage? Who was Isaiah talking with as the chapter opens? Who's the king? Well, it was wicked Ahaz, right? And Ahaz was about to have some serious national problems. He was afraid he'd be invaded. And Isaiah goes to him to counsel him about this. And Isaiah says something like, I couldn't possibly impose upon God to take care of my problem. It's because he didn't want to be indebted to God. So Isaiah has to say to him, therefore the Lord will give you a sign about this matter, and behold, a virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Okay? Now, it's an interesting passage because what Isaiah is telling Ahaz, in effect, is because you have been wicked and have not relied upon God, this son will be born all right, but he's not going to come out of the royal line. He'll not come out of the line that sits on the throne. He'll be born someone else. Well, let's pass on and to further fill out this picture to Micah 5:2. Now, Micah was a contemporary, as we have found in Daniel. Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah. If you look at the introductory verses that each gives, you'll find that each prophesied during the reign of the same king, so they were contemporaries. Now look at Micah 5:2. Micah prophesies, but as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you one will go forth for me to be ruler of Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. So, instead then of being born in Jerusalem, where you would expect a descendant of the royal line of David to have been born, Micah has to say that he'll be born in a small, insignificant city, that of Bethlehem, Once again, though the text doesn't specifically say, I think, informing Ahaz that the Son of God was not to come out of the royal line. Still out of the family of David, but not out of the royal line of David that would sit on the throne. He was to be born instead in Bethlehem, not the royal city. There's another passage in chapter 9 of Isaiah that we'll come back to in just a bit if I have time. But let's turn now to the time of appearance. We've established to a fair degree of certainty the who. We know he would come out of the tribe of Judah. We know, moreover, that he'd be a descendant of Daniel, but not a descendant of one who sat on the throne at the time he came into the world. We found also the place of birth. It was to have been Bethlehem. And let's look next at the time of appearance. First, we go back to Genesis 49, 10, and 11. And you're going to have to take my word for part of this, but I'll give you a reference on it. The text specifically says, the scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh come. Now, what's the scepter a symbol of? Rule and power, all right, as is the ruler's staff. Well, now consider this. The last king who ever sat upon the throne of Judah, of the kingdom of Judah, left the throne about 518 BCE. There was never another king that sat on the throne of Judah after that time. You might point to Herod the Great, but Herod the Great was not a descendant of Judah. He was an Idumean, an Edomite. So how is it then that this gets worked out? Are the scriptures in error on this, that this descendant of Judah would come at a time when still there was a descendant of David upon the throne? Or is Jacob wrong in his prophecy? How does that work out? You see my dilemma? Well, here's what you're going to have to take from my word, and I'll give you a reference on it. Jeremiah, when Jerusalem was destroyed, and it appears just before Jeremiah left Jerusalem, about 518, I'm sorry, it was about 508. Just before he left Jerusalem, he wrote, of course, here are the words, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. And then he left. Well, he left with the royal daughter. He took her into protection and took her with him. And it appears that he took her up into the British Isles. Now, it's going to sound a little bit screwy to you, but there is a good bit of historical evidence that isn't widely known that Jeremiah was the St. Patrick of Ireland. And the royal daughter intermarried up there and produced offspring that ruled and did so to the time that Jesus came into the world. There is an author who spent a lot of time tracing this history. His name was Lynn Totten. He was from Yale University. How many of you know Walter Short? Remember Walter Short? Walter was a wealth of information on this kind of thing. And I was talking with him about this one time. I expressed the problem to him that I just expressed to you, and I didn't have an answer to it at that time. But this author, Lynn Totten, had written some 22 books on this topic, and I hadn't heard of one of them, and I'm fairly familiar with that literature. And Walter pointed out this account that I've just given you about the royal daughter, named, by the way, was Tamar Taffy. And she was taken to Ireland and intermarried with the royalty there and produced offspring, and it was that offspring which prevented made the prophecy of Jacob concerning Judah true, and of David for that matter. Okay, so the Messiah then was to come while some descendant of his still reigned on a throne, but it was not the throne of Judah, it was the throne up in the British Isles. Now, in Daniel, we have found something very interesting also about the time when the Messiah would come into the world. We've just completed chapter 9, and I unfortunately don't have time to expand that for those of you who haven't been in our class. But when the chronology of the book of Daniel is properly understood, it predicts the very time when Jesus would begin his ministry. And that turns out to be the 27th year, and it was about October. And moreover, it predicts the time when he would be crucified, because the book has to say that the Messiah would be cut off when? In the middle of the last 7. So his ministry was for about 3.5 years, and as best we can fix it, he died on April the 7th of AD 30, or in the 31st year. So we have Daniel then to rely upon for the when of the Messiah's appearance. There's a chart you can study. It has on it all the things I've summarized, showing you the 70 heptads of Daniel and so on. So when we turn then to the New Covenant Scriptures, we find the questions that we raised back in the first part of the lesson in the New Covenant Scriptures. Turn, for example, to Matthew, the 1st chapter, and verses 2 through 16. And what you will find there is that Jesus is a descendant of David. He was out of David's family. Look also at Luke 3:23, verses 23 through 38. And you'll find there that Jesus was a descendant of David on the other side of the family, because Matthew gives the genealogy of Jesus on his father's side, as you probably know, and Luke on his mother's side. That's why the two genealogies are not exactly the same. So, yes. Yes, his legal father. Yeah, you're correct. It was not precisely his father. And I guess from one point of view, it is back to his original father, because it was God who created all. Yeah. Okay. That's correct. Yeah. It was the genealogies are a little bit sharper than that, but we find on both sides Jesus went back to David. Well, what about the where of where Jesus was born? Look at Matthew 2:1. What do you find in Matthew 2:1? Where was Jesus born? In Bethlehem. All right, look at Luke 2:4. Does it confirm Matthew? Does it confirm what Matthew says? Luke 2:4. Okay. And it goes on to say, does it not? Because he was of the house of David. That's correct. All right, so we have the who, it came true just as prophesied. We have the where, it came true just as prophesied. And we have the when. Look back at Matthew 2:1. And who's on the throne at this time, by the way? Matthew 2:3. Have you ever wondered why the Magi arrived just this time? Why'd they attach any significance to this star that they had seen? Well, we can't be sure, we can't be for certain, but it's probable, since they came from Babylon, that they knew the prophecies of Daniel. And they knew about when Jesus was to enter the world. Alexander Campbell, in discussing this one time, points out that at the time the Magi arrived in Jerusalem, there was a widespread belief across the world that the Messiah would be born about this time. That can't have come to the Gentiles except through the Babylonians, where Daniel had prophesied. This is interesting because Campbell also points out that some pseudo-prophet had actually picked out a particular year when Jesus would come. And it so terrified the Roman Senate, because they believed this was going to happen. It terrified the Roman Senate, and they forbade that any child who was born that year to be educated, because they realized that only an educated man would sit upon the throne of the world. So, look once again for the when. At Luke 3:1, and then again at 3:23. 3:1, 3:23. What was the time when Jesus was born? Okay, so Tiberius Caesar was on the throne, or I'm sorry, Augustus Caesar was on the throne when Jesus was born. In the Matthew passage that I just mentioned, who was on the throne of Israel? Herod the Great, correct? Herod the Great. Now, Herod the Great died in March of 3 BCE, 3 years before the Christian era. And Jesus had to have been born a little before that, so we can fix his date of birth roughly but fairly accurately. Actually, we can fix it a little more closely than that even, but I haven't time to explain that right now. Look at Luke 3:23, if you will, please. Well, here, let's look at Luke 3:1 first. And what does Luke 3:1 say about our chronology of Jesus? What was the time? 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Now, Grant doesn't like for me to do arithmetic, but I have to ask you to do that because it's quite remarkable. Now think about this. Tiberius Caesar was co-regent with Augustus for 2 years. He began in AD 12. If it's now the 15th year, remember that's 14 plus a fraction. It's not 15 complete, but 14 plus a fraction. If it's now the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, and he began to reign in AD 12, what is the year? Well, it's 12 plus 14 plus a fraction, correct? So it was the 27th year, or 26 complete plus a fraction, when Jesus began his ministry. Now look down at 3:23 of 23rd verse of the same chapter. And how old was Jesus about this time? About 30 years of age. So if I deduct that 30 from 26 and a fraction, I can fairly closely fix, without even looking at any more information, the date of his birth. Okay. So, in the fullness of time, when God brought Jesus into the world, there was a fullness of several factors in the currents of history that made Jesus' mission such that it would be successful. It was, as I mentioned earlier, a social fullness, it was a moral fullness, it was a philosophical fullness, and it was religious fullness. And what we mean by this is the Roman Empire had developed a road system that permitted relatively safe travel across the known world at that time. And people were beginning to travel some, and the cultures became intermingled. They weren't just static cultures that did not intermingle with other cultures, but they had begun to intermingle a little because of travel. It was also a moral fullness because the wiser people of the time had begun to revolt against some of the moral practices of that day. They were prepared for someone who could give them moral standards by which to live. It was a philosophical fullness because the Greek philosophers had reasoned that there was either one God or none at all, that there couldn't be a multiplicity of gods. And Socrates himself had reasoned to the point where he knew there could only be one God responsible for everything that he observed. And of course it was religious fullness because once you realize there's a God, then you begin asking, what does he require of me? And people were beginning to ask what this one God might require, and they were abandoning the practices of paganism. So the mission of Jesus succeeded because of all these currents that flowed together and made it a fullness of time under the hand of God directing history. So as we conclude, the Old Testament records God's promises about the Messiah. The New Testament records the fulfillment of those promises. God kept his promises concerning Jesus, and he can be trusted to keep all of his promises to us. And because of Jesus, and because of God's directing the currents of history, we are a part of those currents. And that gives life meaning and purpose, unlike any that could be had otherwise. Thanks be to him. Any questions or comments? Anything you'd like to say? Well, thank you so much. And we'll resume Daniel the first Sunday we have class after the new year. I believe we'll have 2 more Daniels, and then Grant will take back over. Thank you so much.